There's a way of seeing the world that begins not with what we wish things to be, but with what they are. This way of seeing does not demand that reality conform to our desires, nor does it resist the movements of time and change. It is a perspective that has traveled through centuries, carried in the words of ancient philosophers who sat beneath Mediterranean skies and contemplated the nature of human existence. These thinkers, whom we call Stoics, developed a philosophy that speaks to something fundamental in the human experience, the search for inner peace amid a world that constantly shifts and changes. The Stoic view of life is not a set of rules to be followed, nor is it a promise of happiness delivered through specific practices. It is, instead, a lens through which to perceive existence, a framework for understanding what it means to live as a human being in a world we did not create and cannot fully control. This perspective has endured not because it offers easy answers, but because it addresses questions that every generation must face anew. How do we find stability when everything around us is uncertain? How do we maintain our dignity when circumstances seem to strip it away? How do we live well when we know that our time is limited and that suffering is inevitable? To understand the Stoic view requires patience. It cannot be grasped in a moment or summarized in a few simple principles, though many have tried to reduce it to such. The wisdom of the Stoics unfolds slowly, like a landscape gradually revealing itself as you walk through it. Each step offers a new vantage point, and what seemed clear from one position takes on different dimensions when viewed from another. This is the nature of philosophical understanding. It deepens over time, layer by layer, as you return to the same ideas again and again, each time noticing something you had not seen before. Let us begin, then, by considering the central insight that animates all of Stoic thought, the recognition that some things are within our control and others are not. This distinction, which may seem simple on the surface, contains within it a profound understanding of human freedom and human limitation. The Stoic philosophers observed that much of human suffering arises from a fundamental confusion about this distinction. We expend enormous energy trying to control things that lie beyond our power, while neglecting the one domain where we actually possess authority: our own thoughts, judgments, and responses. Epictetus, who was born a slave in the Roman Empire and later gained his freedom to become one of the most influential Stoic teachers, made this distinction the cornerstone of his philosophy. He taught that we must learn to separate clearly between what is ours and what belongs to others, between what we can influence and what we cannot. Our body, he said, is not fully ours. It can be injured. It ages, it falls ill without asking our permission. Our possessions are not truly ours. They can be taken, lost, or destroyed. Our reputation is not in our hands. Others will form their judgments based on their own perceptions and prejudices, regardless of our wishes. What then is truly ours? Our capacity to perceive, to judge, to choose how we will respond to what happens to us. This inner domain, this space of consciousness and volition, is the only realm where we possess genuine freedom. Everything else is, in the language of the Stoics, indifferent, neither good nor bad in itself, but neutral. What makes these external things seem good or bad is the judgment we place upon them, and that judgment is within our control. This insight does not come easily to most of us. We are raised in a world that tells us constantly that our well-being depends on external things: wealth, status, physical health, the approval of others. We are taught to pursue these things and to fear their loss. The Stoic philosophers do not deny that these external goods have practical value. They recognize that wealth can make life easier, that health is preferable to illness, that friendship enriches our experience. But they insist that none of these things are necessary for living well in the deepest sense. True well-being, what the Stoics called eudaimonia, depends entirely on the quality of our inner life, on the soundness of our judgments, and the virtue of our character. Consider, for a moment, the experience of worry. We worry about countless things: our health, our finances, our relationships, our future. Much of this worry concerns events that have not happened and may never happen. We imagine difficulties and catastrophes, and we suffer from these imagined scenarios as if they were real. The Stoic philosophers observed this tendency in human nature and asked a simple question: what benefit does this worry bring? If there is something we can do to prevent or prepare for a difficulty, then we should do it calmly and rationally. But if there is nothing we can do, or if the event we fear is entirely uncertain, then worry serves no purpose. It is merely a form of self-torment, a voluntary suffering that we add to whatever actual difficulties we may face. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the Roman Empire during a period of plague, war, and political instability, wrote in his personal philosophical journal about the futility of troubling oneself over things that may never occur. He reminded himself repeatedly that we have no way of knowing what the future holds, and that most of the things we fear never come to pass. Even when difficulties do arrive, they rarely have the power to harm. What is most important, our capacity to think clearly and act with integrity. He wrote these reflections not for publication, but as reminders to himself, guidelines for maintaining his equanimity amid the pressures and responsibilities of imperial power. This brings us to another essential aspect of the Stoic view: the relationship between philosophy and practice. The Stoics did not conceive of philosophy as an academic discipline or a theoretical exercise. For them, philosophy was a way of life, a daily practice of paying attention to one's thoughts and reactions, of examining one's judgments and correcting those that lead to disturbance. Seneca, the Roman statesman and philosopher, compared philosophy to medicine for the soul. Just as a sick person needs treatment, not lectures about health, a troubled mind needs practical exercises and consistent practice, not merely beautiful theories. The Stoic philosophers developed specific exercises to help cultivate the perspective they taught. One such exercise involves contemplating the impermanence of all things. We might take an object that we value, a possession, a relationship, a circumstance in our life, and remind ourselves that it will not last forever. This is not meant to be a depressing practice, but rather a way of training ourselves to appreciate what we have while we have it, and to prepare ourselves psychologically for the inevitable changes that time brings. When we fully internalize the transient nature of all external goods, we can enjoy them without becoming dependent on them, and we can lose them without being destroyed. The Stoics often reflected on death, not with morbid fascination, but as a way of putting life into proper perspective. They recognize that the awareness of our mortality, rather than being something to avoid, can actually enhance our experience of living. When we remember that our time is limited, we are less likely to waste it on trivial pursuits or petty grievances. We become more present, more attentive to the reality of each moment. Seneca wrote extensively about how we squander our time, treating it as if it were unlimited, and then suddenly finding ourselves at the end of life wondering where it all went. There is a practice the Stoics recommended called the premeditation of adversity. This involves deliberately imagining that we have lost something we value, or that we are facing a difficulty we fear. The purpose is not to make ourselves anxious, but to practice in our minds the kind of response we would want to have if such a situation actually occurred. By mentally rehearsing how we would handle loss or hardship, we prepare ourselves to face these events with greater calm and wisdom when they arrive. This practice also helps us recognize that the worst thing that can happen is often not as terrible as our initial fearful reaction suggests. It is important to understand that this contemplation of loss and adversity is not the same as pessimism. The Stoics were not pessimists in the sense of believing that everything will turn out badly. Rather, they were realists who recognized that life contains both joy and suffering, success and failure, gain and loss, They understood that clinging to the good times and resisting the difficult times is a recipe for constant emotional turbulence. By accepting that both pleasure and pain are part of the human experience, and that neither is permanent, we can maintain a more stable inner state regardless of external circumstances. This acceptance of life as it is, rather than as we wish it to be, is central to the Stoic perspective. But acceptance does not mean passivity or resignation. The Stoics were often quite active in the world. They were statesmen, teachers, soldiers, and citizens engaged in their communities. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire. Seneca was an advisor to the emperor and a successful playwright. Epictetus, though he lived simply, ran a philosophical school and influenced generations of students. Their philosophy did not lead them to withdraw from life, but rather to engage with it from a position of inner freedom. The key distinction is between accepting what we cannot change while working to improve what we can. We cannot control whether we fall ill, but we can control how we care for our health and how we respond to illness when it comes. We cannot control whether others treat us justly, but we can control whether we act justly toward them. We cannot control the ultimate outcome of our efforts, but we can control whether we make those efforts with full dedication and integrity. This focus on doing what is right regardless of outcome is a hallmark of Stoic ethics. The Stoics believed that virtue, excellence of character, is the only true good. Everything else, while it may have practical value, is ultimately indifferent. This might sound extreme until we consider what it means. Virtue, in Stoic thought, includes wisdom, the ability to perceive clearly and judge accurately; courage, the strength to act rightly despite fear or difficulty; justice, treating others fairly and respecting their dignity; and self-discipline, controlling one's impulses and desires. These qualities are entirely within our control. We can always choose to seek truth rather than comfort, to act with integrity rather than expediency, to treat others with fairness rather than exploiting them for our advantage. Moreover, these virtues cannot be taken from us. A tyrant can strip away our possessions, imprison our body, even threaten our life, but cannot force us to abandon our principles unless we choose to do so. This is the core of Stoic freedom, the recognition that our inner dignity and moral character are inviolable unless we ourselves surrender them. Epictetus, who knew what it meant to be powerless in the eyes of society, insisted that no one could truly harm him, because no one could make him act against his own judgment of what was right. This emphasis on virtue over external goods has profound implications for how we live. It suggests that the primary question we should ask ourselves is not what do I want to achieve, but what kind of person do I want to be. Success, in the Stoic view, is not measured by wealth, fame, or power, but by the quality of one's character and the integrity of one's choices. A person who lives virtuously, even in poverty and obscurity, is more successful than one who gains the whole world through corrupt means. Let us pause here and consider the texture of these ideas. They are not meant to be absorbed quickly or applied mechanically. The Stoic view requires that we sit with these concepts, turning them over in our minds, observing how they relate to our actual experience. When you find yourself disturbed by something, try to identify where the disturbance is coming from. Is it from the event itself, or from your judgment about the event? When you worry about the future, ask yourself what you are actually worried about, and whether it is something within your control. When you feel your peace being disrupted, consider whether you are trying to control something that lies beyond your power. These are not exercises to be done once and then forgotten. They are practices to be repeated daily, perhaps many times throughout the day, as situations arise that challenge our equanimity. The Stoics understood that changing deeply ingrained patterns of thought and reaction takes time and sustained effort. We have spent years, perhaps decades, developing habits of worry, anger, resentment, and craving. We will not undo these patterns overnight, but with patient, consistent practice, we can gradually retrain our minds to respond differently. One of the obstacles to this practice is that we often do not notice when we are disturbing ourselves with mistaken judgments. Our reactions feel automatic, as if they are imposed upon us by external events rather than generated by our own minds. The Stoics taught that we need to develop greater awareness of the gap between impression and judgment. An impression is the initial perception that arises when something happens. We see an event, hear a piece of news, experience a sensation. Judgment is what we add to that impression, the interpretation, the evaluation, the story we tell ourselves about what it means. For example, imagine that someone speaks harshly to you. The impression is simply the words and tone. The judgment might be, they insulted me, they don't respect me, I must defend myself, or any number of other interpretations. These judgments then generate emotional reactions: anger, hurt, indignation. But the Stoics observed that these judgments are not the only possible response to the initial impression. We could just as easily judge that the person is having a difficult day, that their words reflect their own inner turmoil rather than an accurate assessment of us, or simply that harsh words were spoken without any deeper significance. This does not mean we should never feel hurt or angry. The Stoics recognize that initial emotional reactions often arise spontaneously, before we have time to apply philosophical reflection. But we can choose not to elaborate on these reactions, not to add judgment upon judgment, until we work ourselves into a state of disturbance. We can notice the initial feeling, acknowledge it, and then let it pass rather than feeding it with additional thoughts about how wrong the situation is, how badly we have been treated, or what revenge we might take. Marcus Aurelius practiced this kind of attention consistently. In his meditations, he repeatedly reminds himself to look at things as they actually are, stripped of the judgments and associations we typically add to them. He describes techniques for this. When faced with something desirable, describe it in plain physical terms rather than with words that convey judgment about its value. When dealing with a difficult person, remember that they are acting according to their own understanding of what is good, however mistaken that understanding might be. When confronted with your own mortality, recognize that death is simply a natural process, no different from birth or growth or any other change that life involves. This practice of seeing clearly, without the distorting lens of our desires and aversions, is fundamental to Stoic philosophy. It is sometimes called objective representation, or seeing things as they are. The idea is that much of our suffering comes not from reality itself, but from the elaborate stories we tell about reality. We take a simple fact, I did not get the job I wanted, and we elaborate it into a tragedy. I am a failure. I will never succeed. Life is unfair. The person who made the decision is biased against me. Each of these additions takes us further from the simple fact and deeper into disturbance. If we can learn to rest with the simple fact, I did not get this particular job, we may still feel disappointed, but we will not add layers of suffering on top of that disappointment. We will be able to think more clearly about what to do next. Perhaps we need to improve our skills. Perhaps this particular position was not actually a good fit for us. Perhaps the timing was not right. When we are not caught up in dramatic narratives about the event, we can see more clearly what it actually means and how to respond appropriately. This quality of clear seeing is connected to wisdom, one of the cardinal virtues in Stoic thought. Wisdom is not simply knowledge in the sense of having information. It is the ability to perceive accurately, to distinguish between what matters and what does not, to recognize what is within our power and what is not. A wise person sees through the apparent value of things that most people chase: wealth, fame, pleasure, and recognize is that these cannot provide the satisfaction they promise. The wise person also sees the true value of things that many people neglect: integrity, clarity of mind, good judgment, kindness. Wisdom develops gradually through experience and reflection. The Stoics emphasized the importance of learning from both success and failure, from both pleasant and difficult experiences. Every situation can teach us something if we approach it with the right attitude. When things go well, we can observe our reactions and notice if we are becoming too attached, to dependent on these circumstances. Continuing, when things go badly, we can test our principles and see if we can maintain our equanimity in adversity. Both kinds of experience are valuable. Neither is to be sought or avoided for its own sake. Courage, another of the cardinal virtues, takes on a particular meaning in Stoic philosophy. It is not primarily physical bravery, though that may be included. Courage, for the Stoics, is the strength to face difficulty without being thrown off course, to endure pain and loss, without abandoning one's principles, to speak truth even when it is dangerous or unpopular. It is the quality that allows us to live according to our understanding of what is right, regardless of the consequences. This kind of courage requires trust in the Stoic worldview. If we truly believe that virtue is the only good, that external circumstances cannot ultimately harm what is most important, then we can face any situation without fundamental fear. We may still experience the natural shrinking from pain or danger that is part of being human, but this will not control us. We will be able to move through our fear and act according to reason rather than according to our immediate emotional impulses. The Stoics recognize that most people are controlled by two primary forces, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. We organize our lives around seeking what feels good and escaping what feels bad. There's nothing wrong with preferring pleasure to pain. This is natural and reasonable, but when pleasure and pain become our masters, when we will do anything to obtain one and avoid the other, we lose our freedom. We become puppets dancing to the strings of circumstances, our inner state entirely dependent on external events. Justice, the third cardinal virtue, extends the Stoic perspective beyond the individual to our relationships with others. The Stoics believed that human beings are naturally social creatures, designed by nature to live in community and to care for one another. They spoke of humanity as a single body, with each person being like a limb or organ. Just as a hand would not refuse to help the foot, even though they are different parts of the body, so we should not refuse to help our fellow human beings, even when they seem different from us. This cosmopolitan vision was radical in the ancient world, which was characterized by sharp distinctions between Greeks and barbarians, citizens and foreigners, free people and slaves. The Stoics insisted that all human beings share the same rational nature, and therefore all deserve to be treated with respect and fairness. Marcus Aurelius, ruling over a vast empire with many different peoples and cultures, reflected often on this common humanity. He reminded himself that the person who annoyed him, who seemed incompetent or malicious, was nevertheless his kinsman, sharing in the divine reason that animates all rational beings. This perspective does not require that we like everyone or ignore differences in character and behavior. The Stoics were quite clear-eyed about human failings, but it does require that we treat everyone justly, that we recognize their basic dignity, regardless of their social status or personal qualities. It also means that when others act badly, we should respond with patience and understanding rather than anger and contempt. They are acting in ignorance, doing what they believe will bring them good even when they are mistaken about what is truly good. The practice of justice also includes recognizing our debts to others. None of us creates ourselves or achieves anything entirely through our own efforts. We are born into families and societies that nurture us, teach us language, provide us with knowledge accumulated over generations. We benefit from the work of countless people, those who grow our food, build our infrastructure, create the tools and systems we use daily. Recognizing this interconnection, the Stoics believed we have a duty to contribute to the common good, to use our abilities in service of the whole, not merely for our own advantage. Temperance, the fourth cardinal virtue, is the capacity for self-control, for moderation in our desires and impulses. This virtue has perhaps been most misunderstood, sometimes reduced to mere abstinence or denial of pleasure. But the Stoic conception of temperance is more subtle. It is not about refusing all pleasure or living an austere life for its own sake. Rather, it is about maintaining our freedom in relation to pleasure and desire. The Stoics observed that desires have a way of multiplying and intensifying when we indulge them without limit. A person who has modest means and simple tastes can be quite content, but let that person acquire wealth and develop expensive habits, and they will soon find their new level of consumption just as necessary as the old level was. They are no happier, perhaps less so, because now they have more to worry about, more to maintain, more to potentially lose. They have become enslaved to their desires instead of being served by their possessions. Temperance means enjoying what we have without being controlled by our appetites. It means being able to appreciate a simple meal as much as an elaborate one, being comfortable with modest pleasures rather than always seeking more intense stimulation. This self-control is valuable not because pleasure is bad, but because freedom is good. When we are not driven by constant craving, when we can be satisfied with enough rather than always wanting more, we are more stable, more resilient, more able to maintain our peace of mind regardless of circumstances. Seneca wrote extensively about the dangers of luxury and the benefits of voluntary simplicity. He recommended periodically living very simply, perhaps eating only plain food and sleeping on a hard bed. Not as punishment but as practice. This practice serves several purposes. It reminds us that we can be content with very little, reducing our fear of poverty. It makes us more appreciative of the comforts we normally enjoy. It strengthens our self-control and our ability to endure discomfort when necessary. And it keeps us from becoming soft, from losing our capacity to handle difficulty. These four virtues, wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, are not separate qualities but different aspects of a unified excellence of character. They support and reinforce each other. Wisdom helps us understand what courage is needed for, what justice requires, where temperance should be applied. Courage gives us strength to act on what wisdom reveals and to uphold justice even when it costs us. Justice directs our actions toward the common good rather than merely our own advantage. Temperance keeps us from being distracted by pleasure or thrown off course by desire. The Stoics believed that cultivating these virtues is the proper work of a human life. We are not born with perfect character. We must develop it through practice and attention. This is not a burden, but an opportunity. It means that regardless of the circumstances we find ourselves in, regardless of our past failures or present difficulties, we can always begin to work on our character. We can always choose in this moment to respond with wisdom rather than folly, with courage rather than cowardice, with justice rather than selfishness, with temperance rather than excess. This view implies a kind of radical responsibility. We cannot blame our parents, our society, our genetics, or our circumstances for the quality of our character. Certainly these factors influence us, and the Stoics recognized this. But influence is not the same as determination. Between the influences upon us and our response to them, there is a space, the space of our own judgment and choice. In that space lies our freedom and our responsibility. When the Stoics speak of living in accordance with nature, they mean several things. First, they mean recognizing and accepting the natural order of things, that we are mortal, that change is constant, that we depend on countless factors beyond our control. Fighting against these realities is futile and creates suffering. Second, they mean living according to our own nature as rational beings. Our capacity for reason is what distinguishes us and makes possible our particular form of flourishing. To live in accordance with reason means to base our actions on clear thinking rather than on impulse, prejudice, or the mere following of convention. Third, living in accordance with nature means recognizing our place in the larger whole. We are not isolated individuals, but parts of a cosmos, members of a human community, participants in the cycles of nature. The Stoics had a vision of the universe as a unified, rationally ordered whole, which they sometimes called Zeus or God or nature. They believe that everything that happens is part of this larger pattern, even if we cannot always see how it fits. This belief might seem to imply fatalism. If everything is determined by the rational order of the cosmos, what room is there for human choice? The Stoics answered this apparent paradox by distinguishing between external events, which are indeed determined by causes beyond our control, and our judgments and responses, which are within our power. We cannot control what happens to us, but we can control what we make of it, how we interpret it, how we respond to it. Imagine a plant growing in a particular soil, in a particular climate, with a particular amount of sun and water. All of these external conditions are given. The plant does not choose them, but within those conditions, the plant grows according to its own nature. An oak seed becomes an oak tree, not a pine tree, regardless of the conditions. Similarly, we are born into circumstances we did not choose, with a body and temperament we did not select. But within these given conditions, we can develop our character according to our nature as rational beings. We can choose how we respond to what we encounter. This acceptance of fate or fati, as Nietzsche would later call it in a Stoic spirit, is not passive resignation. It is active engagement with reality as it is, rather than as we wish it were. It is saying yes to life in its totality, the pleasant and the painful together. When we resist what has already happened, when we waste energy wishing things were different, we make ourselves miserable without changing anything. When we accept what is and focus our energy on our response, we are working with reality rather than against it. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that everything that happens to him is material for virtue. A difficult person is an opportunity to practice patience. An injury or illness is a chance to demonstrate courage. A loss is an occasion to test whether we have truly internalized the impermanence of all things. From this perspective, nothing that happens is purely bad. Every experience can be used as raw material for the development of character. This does not mean we should be glad when bad things happen, or that we should not work to prevent harm and suffering. The Stoics were not advocates of passivity or indifference to suffering. They believed we should do what we reasonably can to promote health, prosperity, and peace. These are preferred indifference, things that have practical value even though they are not good in the deepest sense. But when, despite our efforts, things go badly, we should not be shaken. We should recognize that we did what we could with what was in our power, and the rest was never ours to control. There's a serenity in this perspective that many find deeply attractive. It offers a way to engage fully with life without being devastated when things do not go as we hoped. It provides a stable ground to stand on when external circumstances are chaotic. But this serenity must not be confused with apathy or emotional numbness. The Stoics did not advocate becoming unfeeling. Seneca wrote movingly about grief, acknowledging that it is natural and appropriate to feel pain when we lose someone we love. What he cautioned against was excessive grief that goes on indefinitely, or that makes us unable to function. The same applies to other emotions. It is natural to feel afraid when facing danger, to feel disappointed when we fail at something important, to feel frustrated when others act badly. The question is what we do with these feelings. Do we allow them to control us, to dictate our actions, to persist long after they have served any useful purpose? Or do we acknowledge them, understand them, and then make our choices based on reason rather than being driven by emotion? This balanced approach to emotion is one of the most psychologically sophisticated aspects of Stoic philosophy. The Stoics distinguished between the initial involuntary reaction, what they called the first movement of emotion, and what we do with that reaction. The first movement is not within our control. It arises automatically from our nature as feeling beings. But whether we elaborate on it, feed it with judgments, and allow it to become a passion that overwhelms reason, this is within our control. For example, if someone insults us, we may feel an immediate flash of anger. This first movement is natural. But if we then start thinking about how wrong the insult was, how we must retaliate, how this person always treats us badly, and so on. We are adding fuel to the fire. We are choosing to become more angry, to sustain and intensify the emotion through our own mental activity. If instead we recognize the initial flash of anger and simply let it be, neither suppressing it nor feeding it, it will likely pass quite quickly, and we will be able to respond to the situation calmly and rationally. This approach requires practice and self-awareness. We need to become familiar with our own patterns of emotional reaction. Do we tend to anger, anxiety, sadness? What triggers these reactions? What thoughts do we typically add to them? By observing ourselves carefully, we can start to see the gap between the initial impression and our elaboration of it. In that gap lies the possibility of choice. The Stoics developed various exercises to help cultivate this self-awareness and self-control. Morning meditation was one, taking time at the beginning of each day to think about what challenges might arise and how one wants to respond to them. Evening reflection was another, reviewing the day's events, noticing where one acted well and where one fell short, not for the purpose of self-blame, but for learning and improvement. They also practiced mindfulness of the present moment, reminding themselves throughout the day to pay attention to what is actually happening rather than being lost in thoughts about past or future. Another practice was studying the lives and writings of exemplary people. The Stoics believed that we learn virtue not only through abstract reasoning, but also through imitating good examples. They would read about historical figures who demonstrated courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance, and they would try to imagine how these people would handle various situations. They would ask themselves, what would Socrates do in this situation? Or how would Cato respond to this challenge? This use of role models is based on the recognition that we are social beings who learn largely through imitation. From childhood, we absorb patterns of thought and behavior from those around us. If we have been surrounded by people who react to difficulties with panic or anger, we will likely have learned these reactions. But we can deliberately choose new models and reshape our patterns through conscious imitation of people who embody the qualities we want to develop. Seneca particularly emphasized the value of friendship with someone more advanced in philosophy. He suggested that we should imagine we are always in the presence of a wise person who can see all our thoughts and actions. This imagined observer serves as a gentle conscience, encouraging us to live up to our best self. Of course, in Stoic thought, we are always in the presence of the divine reason that pervades the cosmos, the logos that is both immanent in us and transcendent. But personifying this presence as a wise friend or teacher can make it more psychologically effective. The concept of logos is central to Stoic metaphysics, though it need not be understood in a religious sense. Logos means reason or rational principle. The Stoics believed that the universe is structured according to reason, that there is an intelligible order to things. This is what makes science possible. We can understand natural patterns because nature operates according to consistent principles. It is also what makes ethics possible. There are better and worse ways to live, not merely according to our subjective preferences, but according to our nature as rational beings. Human reason, in Stoic thought, is a fragment or spark of this universal reason. We are each a small instance of the logos that orders the cosmos. This means that when we think clearly, when our reason is functioning well, we are aligned with the structure of reality itself. Conversely, when our thinking is confused, driven by false beliefs and irrational desires, we are out of harmony with nature, and this disharmony manifests as suffering. This view has profound implications. It suggests that truth and virtue are not arbitrary conventions, but rooted in the nature of things. It also suggests that we have a kinship not only with other humans, but with the cosmos itself. We are not strangers in an alien universe, but expressions of the same rational principle that orders the stars and seasons. This can be a source of deep comfort. We belong here. We are part of the whole. Our reason connects us to everything that exists. At the same time, this view calls us to humility. If we are each only a small part of a vast cosmos, our individual concerns and grievances are proportionally small. This perspective can help us not to take ourselves too seriously, not to inflate our problems into cosmic dramas. Marcus Aurelius frequently reminded himself of the immensity of space and time. He imagined viewing the earth from high above, seeing all the lands and seas, all the people pursuing their various aims, and he would ask himself, how significant is this thing I am upset about when seen from this perspective? This practice of zooming out, of seeing our situation in a larger context, is valuable for maintaining proportion in our judgments. We tend to become absorbed in our immediate concerns and to lose sight of the bigger picture. When we are angry with someone, we forget that they are a fellow human being who will die, as we will, that both of us are tiny specks in an immense universe existing for a brief moment in cosmic time. This recognition does not mean our concerns do not matter, but it does mean they need not overwhelm us. The Stoics also practiced zooming in, paying close attention to the present moment, to the task at hand, to the person in front of us. They believed that each moment contains all we need to practice virtue and live well. We do not need perfect circumstances or a better future moment. Right now, whatever is happening, we can respond with wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Right now, we can be the person we want to be. This focus on the present is not about denying past and future, but about recognizing where our power actually lies. We cannot change the past, though we can learn from it. We cannot control the future, though we can influence it through present action. All we ever actually have is the current moment. This moment may seem insignificant, just another moment of ordinary life, but it is the only moment in which we can live, the only moment in which we can make choices. Treating each present moment as precious, as the arena in which our life is actually happening, transforms how we experience time. Many people live as if their real life is always somewhere else in the past they remember or imagine, in the future they are working toward or dreading. But the past is gone and cannot be recovered. The future is uncertain and may never arrive. Only the present is real. If we spend all our present moments thinking about other times, we miss the only life we actually have. The Stoics understood this and counseled intense presence to each moment as it arises. This presence includes being attentive to our own mental activity. Much of the time, our minds run on autopilot, producing a constant stream of thoughts, judgments, fantasies, and memories without our conscious direction. The Stoics taught that we should observe this mental activity, noticing what kinds of thoughts arise and whether they are helpful or harmful. We should learn to identify the thoughts that disturb us, the catastrophizing, the resentment, the worry, and recognize that these thoughts are not facts, but judgments we are making. For instance, if we find ourselves thinking, "This is terrible, I cannot stand this," we can notice that this is a judgment, not a description of reality. What actually is the situation? Perhaps something uncomfortable or disappointing has happened, but terrible and cannot stand our interpretations we are adding. Can we describe the situation more accurately? "I did not get what I wanted. This is uncomfortable." These more neutral descriptions are less likely to generate intense disturbance. The practice of questioning our initial judgments and looking for more accurate descriptions is sometimes called Stoic mindfulness or philosophical mindfulness. It differs somewhat from Buddhist mindfulness practices, but shares some common elements. Both approaches involve observing mental activity without being carried away by it. Both recognize that much suffering is self-created through our thoughts and reactions, and both offer practices for developing greater awareness and equanimity. However, Stoic practice is more explicitly focused on examining the truth of our beliefs. It asks not only "What am I thinking?" but "Is this thought accurate? Is this judgment true?" The Stoics believed that most disturbing emotions rest on false beliefs about what is good and bad, about what we need to be happy, about what we can control. By examining these beliefs and correcting them when they are mistaken, we can transform our emotional life. This philosophical therapy, this treatment of the soul through examining and correcting false beliefs, was central to Stoic practice. Philosophers like Epictetus and Seneca saw themselves as physicians of the soul, helping people identify the false judgments that were making them sick with anxiety, anger, grief, or craving. They would ask questions, offer alternative perspectives, point out contradictions, all aimed at helping the person see their situation more clearly and respond more rationally. This therapeutic aspect of Stoicism has influenced many modern psychotherapies, most notably cognitive behavioral therapy, which shares the Stoic insight that our emotions are largely determined by our thoughts and that by changing our thinking patterns, we can change how we feel. Of course, modern psychology has its own methods and evidence base, but it is interesting that ancient philosophy arrived at similar insights through reflection and observation of human nature. One area where Stoic practice remains particularly relevant is in dealing with adversity. Life inevitably brings difficulties: illness, loss, failure, betrayal, aging, death. How we handle these difficulties largely determines the quality of our life. Many people are devastated by adversity because they have built their well-being on foundations that adversity can destroy. If your happiness depends on your health, what happens when you become ill? If it depends on your success, what happens when you fail? If it depends on being loved by particular people, what happens when those relationships end? The Stoic approach is to build your well-being on a foundation that adversity cannot touch the quality of your own character and the soundness of your own judgments. This foundation remains stable regardless of external changes. You can be virtuous in poverty or wealth, in health or illness, in success or failure. The circumstances affect what you do but not who you are. When you base your self-worth on something internal and within your control, external losses, while they may be disappointing or painful, do not destroy you. This is not to say that Stoics feel no pain when bad things happen. They are not made of stone, but their pain is proportionate and does not spiral into devastation because they have not made the mistake of thinking that their well-being depends on things they cannot control. They know that their deepest good, their virtue, their capacity for reason, their dignity as rational beings remains intact as long as they maintain it. There is a story about Epictetus that illustrates this. When he was still a slave, his master began to twist his leg, either as punishment or perhaps as idle cruelty. Epictetus calmly warned him, "You will break it." When the leg was indeed broken, Epictetus simply said, "Did I not tell you that you would break it?" He did not cry out in anger or self-pity. He had long ago accepted that his body was not fully his own, that it could be injured, that such things happen. His equanimity was not broken because it did not depend on his leg being intact. This example might seem extreme, and few of us will be tested in such brutal ways. But the principle applies to all the smaller adversities we face. When someone treats us rudely, when we get stuck in traffic, when our plans fall through, when we do not get what we hoped for, in all these situations, we can choose how to respond. We can let these external events dictate our inner state, or we can maintain our calm by recognizing that nothing truly bad has happened to us as long as we respond virtuously. The distinction between what is truly good and what merely seems good is fundamental to Stoic ethics. What seems good are things like wealth, health, pleasure, reputation, success. These things have what the Stoics called preferred value. All else being equal, they are worth having. But they are not good in the deepest sense, because having them does not make us good people, and lacking them does not make us bad people. They are tools that can be used well or badly. What is truly good is virtue, excellence of character expressed through wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. This is good not because it leads to something else we want, but because it is the fulfillment of our nature as rational beings. It is intrinsically valuable, worth choosing for its own sake, and it is sufficient for happiness, in the sense that a virtuous person can maintain their inner well-being regardless of external circumstances. This is perhaps the most controversial claim of Stoic philosophy, that virtue is sufficient for happiness. Many people find this claim implausible. Surely, they object, someone who is virtuous, but suffering from terrible disease or poverty or loss cannot be called happy. The Stoics would respond that it depends on what we mean by happiness. If we mean a life filled with pleasure and free from pain, then no, virtue alone cannot guarantee that. But if we mean a life that is well lived, that fulfills our human potential, that we can look back on with satisfaction regardless of how much pleasure or pain it contained, then yes, virtue is sufficient. Consider someone who maintains their integrity under great pressure, who treats others fairly even when it costs them, who faces hardship with courage and accepts loss with grace. Such a person may not be pleased with their circumstances, but can they not still feel a deep satisfaction in having lived well, in having been true to their principles? Compare them to someone who has all the external goods, but has gained them through corruption, who lives in fear that their misdeeds will be discovered, who looks back on a life of compromised principles. Which person would you rather be? The Stoics believe that, when we really think it through, we would all prefer to be the virtuous person, even if it means having fewer external goods. This preference reveals what we truly value at the deepest level. We may be attracted to wealth and pleasure, but we respect and admire virtue. We may envy the rich and successful, but we honor those who live with integrity. This suggests that virtue is indeed what we most fundamentally care about, even when our surface desires point elsewhere. This insight can reorient our lives. Instead of asking, how can I get what I want, we might ask, how can I become the kind of person I would respect? Instead of pursuing goals that, even if achieved, will leave us hungry for more, we might cultivate qualities that grow richer over time and cannot be taken away. This shift in focus from having to being, from external goods to internal excellence, is at the heart of the philosophical life. Living philosophically, in the Stoic sense, means making this focus on character development central to one's life. It means treating each day as an opportunity to practice virtue, each challenge as a chance to test and strengthen one's principles. It means regularly examining one's thoughts and actions, noticing where one falls short, and working to improve. It means studying wisdom both by reading philosophical texts and by reflecting on one's own experience. The Stoics recommended having a philosophical practice or routine. This might include morning meditation to prepare oneself for the day, reflecting on Stoic principles and anticipating challenges. It might include evening review, looking back on the day's events and assessing how well one lived up to one's principles. It might include studying philosophical texts, discussing philosophy with friends, or writing out one's own thoughts as Marcus Aurelius did. These practices serve to keep philosophy alive and active in one's life rather than letting it remain abstract theory. It is easy to read about Stoic principles and think, yes, that makes sense, but then go on living exactly as before. The challenge is to internalize these principles so deeply that they actually shape how we think and respond in the moment. This requires repetition, practice, and patience. One helpful practice is to have certain sayings or reminders that we can recall in challenging situations. Epictetus might remind himself some things are up to us and others are not. Marcus Aurelius might think this too shall pass, or what stands in the way becomes the way. Seneca might remember we suffer more in imagination than in reality. These phrases serve as anchors, bringing us back to philosophical perspective when we are getting caught up in reactivity. Another practice is to regularly contemplate the lives of exemplary people. As mentioned earlier, we might read biographies of people who embodied the qualities we admire. We might reflect on how they handled difficulties, what principles guided their choices, what we can learn from both their successes and their failures. This practice helps us see that living philosophically is not just an abstract ideal, but something that real people have actually done in concrete circumstances. We might also find it helpful to have a philosophical community, friends or colleagues, who share an interest in living wisely and with whom we can discuss these ideas. The Stoics valued friendship highly and saw it as an important support for philosophical practice. Having people in our lives who understand what we are trying to do who can offer perspective when we are struggling, who can point out when we are falling into old patterns. This is invaluable. At the same time, the Stoics recognize that each person must ultimately walk their own path. We cannot depend on others to make us virtuous. We cannot blame our environment or our relationships if we fail to live according to our principles. Each of us is responsible for our own character, our own choices, our own inner life. This responsibility is weighty, but it is also liberating. It means that we always have the power to begin again, to choose differently, to work on ourselves regardless of what anyone else is doing. This brings us back to the question of freedom. The Stoics offered a profound redefinition of freedom. Most people think of freedom as the ability to do whatever you want, to have no constraints on your choices, but the Stoics recognize that this kind of freedom is an illusion. We are always constrained by our circumstances, by physical laws, by the needs of our body, by our relationships with others. If we define freedom as the absence of constraints, we will never be free and will always be resentful of the limits we face. But if we define freedom as the Stoics did, as living according to reason, as maintaining our inner sovereignty regardless of external constraints, then freedom becomes possible even in difficult circumstances. A slave can be free in this sense if they maintain their own judgment and do not let external force compel them to act against their understanding of what is right. An emperor can be enslaved if they are ruled by passion and fear, constantly adjusting their behavior to try to please others or protect their position. True freedom, then, is not about having no constraints, but about choosing rightly within whatever constraints we face. It is about not being ruled by irrational desires or fears. It is about maintaining the space between stimulus and response, the space in which we exercise judgment and choice. This space is where our humanity lives, where our dignity resides, and no external force can take it away unless we surrender it. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, wrote powerfully about this Stoic conception of freedom. Even in the most dehumanizing conditions imaginable, he observed that people retained the freedom to choose their attitude, to decide what meaning they would give to their suffering. Some prisoners became brutalized and gave up their humanity. Others maintained their dignity and even helped their fellow prisoners at cost to themselves. The external circumstances were the same for both groups. What differed was their inner response. Frankl concluded that this freedom to choose one's attitude is the last human freedom, the one that can never be taken away. This is essentially the Stoic position. We may not be able to control what happens to us, but we can always control how we relate to what happens, what meaning we make of it, what kind of person we choose to be in the face of it. This is an enormously empowering realization, though it also places great responsibility on us. If we cannot blame our circumstances for our inner state, if we acknowledge that our suffering comes largely from our own judgments rather than from events themselves, then we must take responsibility for our inner life. This can be uncomfortable at first. It means we cannot play the victim, cannot simply say, "Of course I am miserable. Look at what has happened to me." The Stoics would gently but firmly say, "Yes, difficult things have happened, but your misery comes from your judgments about what has happened, and those judgments are within your power to change." This is not about denying that genuinely bad things happen. The Stoics were not naive optimists who pretended that everything is fine. They recognized that life contains real difficulties, real losses, real pain. What they denied is that these external adversities can destroy what is most important: our capacity to respond virtuously, to maintain our inner freedom and dignity. When we understand this, difficult circumstances become less overwhelming because we see that they do not have the power we feared they had. This perspective is particularly helpful with worry and anxiety, which often involve imagining terrible future scenarios and suffering from these imagined events as if they were real. The Stoics would ask, "Has this thing actually happened? No. Might it happen? Perhaps. Can you do anything about it? If yes, do it. If no, then why worry?" Worrying does not prevent the event. It merely makes you suffer twice, once in imagination and once in reality if the event actually occurs. Moreover, Most of the things we worry about never happen, and when difficult things do happen, they are often not as terrible as we imagined. We have more strength and resilience than we give ourselves credit for. We can handle difficulties that we thought would destroy us. The Stoics encouraged us to trust in our capacity to respond to whatever life brings, rather than living in constant fear of possible future hardships. This trust is based on the recognition that we have within us the resources we need to live well. We have reason, which can guide us through confusion. We have the capacity for courage, which can carry us through fear. We have the ability to treat others fairly even when we are hurting. We have the power of self-control, which can help us resist destructive impulses. These inner resources are always available to us if we choose to use them. The Stoic path is not about achieving a state of permanent bliss or never feeling any difficulty. It is about developing an inner stability that persists through the ups and downs of life. It is about cultivating a character that remains consistent regardless of circumstances. It is about learning to find satisfaction in the practice of virtue itself, rather than in the achievement of external goals. This shift from goal-oriented to process-oriented living is subtle, but profound. When we are goal-oriented, our well-being depends on achieving particular outcomes. We are anxious until we reach the goal, perhaps briefly satisfied when we achieve it, and then anxious again as we pursue the next goal. This creates a life of constant striving, with only intermittent satisfaction. When we become process-oriented, we find satisfaction in the ongoing practice of living well, regardless of whether we are achieving particular goals. We can enjoy the journey itself, not just the destination. This does not mean we should not have goals or work toward achievements. The Stoics had goals. Marcus Aurelius worked to govern his empire well. Seneca wrote plays and philosophical works. Epictetus taught students, but they held their goals lightly, recognizing that the outcome was not entirely in their control, and that their well-being did not depend on achieving them. What mattered was that they worked toward these goals with full commitment and integrity, doing their best and accepting whatever resulted. This attitude of working diligently while remaining detached from results is sometimes called acting without attachment. It means giving our full effort to whatever we undertake, but not being crushed if the results are not what we hoped. We control the effort. We do not control the outcome. Many factors beyond our power influence whether our efforts succeed. If we have done our best, we can be satisfied regardless of the outcome. If we have not done our best, then even success is somewhat hollow because we know we did not earn it fully. The Stoics applied this principle to all areas of life. In relationships, we can act with love and kindness without demanding that others love us back. In work, we can do our job excellently without requiring recognition or promotion. In creative endeavors, we can make our art with full commitment without needing it to be praised or commercially successful. This is tremendously liberating because it means our satisfaction does not depend on other people's responses or on circumstances working out favorably. Of course, we naturally prefer when our efforts are reciprocated, recognized, and successful. The Stoics did not deny this. What they denied is that these preferred outcomes are necessary for our well-being, or that their absence should disturb our peace. We can be disappointed without being devastated, prefer without demanding, hope without depending on hope being fulfilled. This emotional flexibility allows us to engage fully with life while remaining psychologically resilient. Another area where Stoic philosophy offers practical wisdom is in dealing with other people. Human relationships are one of the greatest sources of both joy and suffering. How we relate to others, family, friends, colleagues, strangers has enormous impact on the quality of our life. The Stoics offered several insights that can improve our relationships. First, as mentioned earlier, the Stoics taught that we should remember our common humanity with others. Even people who annoy us, who seem hostile or foolish, share our rational nature and are doing what they think is best based on their understanding. This recognition can cultivate patience and compassion. When someone acts badly, we can think, they are confused about what is good, they are making mistakes in judgment, they are suffering from false beliefs. This perspective is more conducive to helpful response than if we simply condemn them as evil or stupid. Second, the Stoics taught that we cannot control other people's behavior. We can influence others through our example and our words, but we cannot make them think or act as we wish. Accepting this limitation can reduce a great deal of friction in relationships. Many conflicts arise because we are trying to change someone who does not want to change, or we are demanding that they behave differently when they see no reason to do so. When we accept that others will do what they think is right, according to their own judgment, we can let go of this futile struggle. This does not mean we should never try to influence others, or that we should accept harmful behavior. If someone is acting in ways that harm themselves or others, and if we are in a position to help, we can offer our perspective, share our concerns, provide support, but we do this without attachment to the outcome, recognizing that ultimately they will make their own choices. If they do not take our advice or change their behavior, we do not need to feel frustrated or angry. We have done what we could. The rest is not in our control. Third, the Stoics taught that we should be careful about the judgments we make regarding others' intentions. Often we assume we know why someone did something, and we assign negative motives to them. But we rarely have complete information about another person's situation, thoughts, or reasons. What looks like rudeness might be distraction due to personal worries. What seems like incompetence might be lack of training. What appears to be malice might be misunderstanding. By suspending judgment about others' intentions and giving them the benefit of the doubt, we avoid creating unnecessary conflict and disturbance in ourselves. Even if we are correct that someone acted with bad intent, getting angry about it does not help us or them. It is more effective to address the behavior calmly and clearly, without the added emotional charge that comes from making negative assumptions about character and intent. Fourth, the Stoics recommended being honest and straightforward in our dealings with others. We should say what we mean and mean what we say. We should not manipulate or deceive, even when we think it might be to our advantage. This honesty is both a matter of justice, treating others with respect, and of maintaining our own integrity. When we are honest, we do not have to keep track of lies or worry about being found out. We can interact with others simply and directly, which reduces stress and builds trust. At the same time, honesty does not mean being cruel or tactless. The Stoics valued speaking appropriately to the situation and the person. Sometimes the most honest thing to do is to remain silent, to hold back words that would hurt without helping. Wisdom includes knowing when to speak and when to refrain, what to say, and how to say it. The goal is to be truthful while also being kind and helpful. Fifth, the Stoics taught that we should be grateful for the people in our lives, but not dependent on them. We can love others deeply, enjoy their company, appreciate what they add to our life, but we should remember that they are separate beings with their own lives and choices, and that circumstances may separate us. This awareness is not meant to make us cold or distant, but to help us appreciate the time we have together without clinging. The premeditation of loss, which the Stoics practiced regarding all external goods, applies also to people. We might occasionally remind ourselves that the people we love are mortal, that our time with them is limited, that we do not know how long we will have them in our lives. This contemplation is not morbid if done in the right spirit. It can help us treat our loved ones with more kindness, patience, and appreciation. It can motivate us not to take them for granted or waste the time we have together on petty grievances. At the same time, this awareness prepares us psychologically for the inevitable losses that life brings. Everyone experiences the death of loved ones, the ending of relationships, the geographical separation from people we care about. If we have been practicing seeing these people as mortal and temporary, not in a depressing way but in a realistic way, then when loss comes, we are better able to accept it without being destroyed. We can grieve appropriately without feeling that something unnatural or unfair has happened. Death and change are natural. Resisting them is what causes excessive suffering. Seneca wrote beautifully about grief, acknowledging its naturalness, while also cautioning against letting it become excessive or prolonged. He suggested that we honor the dead by living well, by carrying forward what we learn from them, by becoming the kind of person they would be proud of. This is more useful than remaining stuck in grief indefinitely. At some point, we must return to life, continue our own journey, fulfill our own responsibilities. The dead would want this for us. This balanced approach to grief, allowing natural sorrow without falling into despair, is characteristic of Stoic psychology. The Stoics always sought the middle path between emotional suppression and emotional excess. They did not advocate becoming heartless, but neither did they approve of being overwhelmed by passion. The goal was to feel appropriately, to have emotions that fit the situation and that do not persist beyond their usefulness. This moderation applies to positive emotions as well as negative ones. The Stoics cautioned against excessive joy or excitement, not because pleasure is bad, but because what goes up must come down. If we allow ourselves to become elated over some piece of good fortune, we are setting ourselves up for a corresponding depression when circumstances change. Better to maintain a steady, moderate satisfaction that persists regardless of whether things are going particularly well or particularly badly. This might sound like a prescription for a bland, emotionless life, but that is not what the Stoics intended. They believed that the philosophical life, lived with virtue and wisdom, produces a profound and lasting joy that is superior to the fleeting pleasures and pains that most people experience. This joy comes from living in harmony with nature, from maintaining one's integrity, from exercising one's rational capacities well. It is quieter than euphoria, but deeper and more reliable. Marcus Aurelius described this state as being like a rocky headland against which the waves crash, but which stands unmoved, quieting the waters around it. This image captures the Stoic ideal: not a life without difficulties or disturbances, but a character that remains stable in the face of them, that perhaps even calms the disturbances rather than being disturbed by them. When we maintain our composure, we are better able to think clearly, act effectively, and help others. Our stability can be a resource not only for ourselves but for those around us. This ideal of philosophical calm is cultivated through the practices we have been discussing: regular self-examination, correction of false judgments, meditation on principles, contemplation of impermanence, practicing virtue in daily situations, studying exemplary lives. These practices, repeated over time, gradually reshape our habitual patterns of thought and reaction. We begin to respond differently to situations that previously would have disturbed us. We find ourselves less anxious, less angry, less prone to extreme reactions. This transformation does not happen overnight. The Stoics were realistic about how difficult it is to change ingrained patterns. Epictetus compared philosophy to athletic training. It requires consistent practice over a long period. We should not be discouraged if we do not immediately become wise and virtuous. We should think of ourselves as students who are learning and improving gradually. Every time we remember to apply a Stoic principle, every time we catch ourselves in a false judgment and correct it, we are making progress. Progress in philosophy is not always linear. We may have periods of rapid improvement followed by setbacks. We may handle one situation well and then fall back into old patterns in another situation. This is normal and to be expected. The important thing is to keep practicing, to learn from our mistakes, to recommit to the path after we stumble. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, we can always begin again, in this very moment, regardless of how we have done in the past. The Stoics distinguished between three stages of philosophical development. First is the person who is just beginning, who understands the principles intellectually, but has not yet internalized them and still reacts in conventional ways. Second is the person who is making progress, who sometimes applies philosophical principles successfully, but still struggles and falls back into old patterns. Third is the sage or wise person, who has fully internalized the principles and responds virtuously with complete consistency. The Stoics acknowledge that the third stage, the perfectly wise sage, is perhaps only theoretical, an ideal to aim for rather than a state many actually achieve. Even the greatest Stoic teachers did not claim to be sages. They considered themselves students, works in progress, but the sage serves as a model, a vision of what human nature is capable of when fully developed. We can use this ideal as a guide while accepting that we will likely never fully reach it. This humility about one's own imperfection is important. We should be patient with ourselves, recognizing that philosophical development is a long journey. At the same time, we should be honest about our faults and committed to improving them. The balance between self-acceptance and striving for improvement is delicate. If we are too hard on ourselves, we create unnecessary suffering and may even give up. If we are too accepting, we may become complacent and stop working on ourselves. The Stoic approach is to accept where we are right now. This is the reality. This is our starting point, while also committing to moving toward greater wisdom and virtue. We acknowledge our faults without drowning in guilt or self-hatred. We see them clearly, so that we can work on them, but we do not define ourselves by them. We recognize that we are capable of change, that we are not fixed in stone, that our character is always being shaped by our choices. This perspective on human nature is ultimately optimistic, though not naively so. The Stoics believe that every person has the potential for wisdom and virtue because every person has reason, which connects us to the divine logos. Our rational capacity is like a seed that can grow if properly cultivated, but it must be cultivated. It does not develop automatically. Many people live their whole lives without ever seriously engaging in this cultivation, letting their potential remain unrealized. This is what the Stoics saw as the great tragedy of human life: not that we suffer, for suffering is natural and inevitable, but that we fail to develop our nature, that we live beneath our potential, that we remain enslaved to false beliefs and irrational passions when we could be free. This is why they devoted themselves to philosophy, and why they encouraged others to do the same. They saw philosophical practice as the essential work of a human life, more important than any worldly achievement. This does not mean that worldly activities, work, family, civic engagement are unimportant. The Stoics fully engaged in these domains, but they approach them philosophically, seeing them as contexts in which to practice virtue rather than as ends in themselves. One works not primarily to make money, but to contribute to society and to practice diligence and excellence. One raises a family not to satisfy social expectations, but to fulfill natural duties and to practice love and patience. One participates in civic life not to gain power, but to promote justice and the common good. This philosophical approach transforms ordinary activities. Instead of being merely instrumental things we must do to get what we want, they become intrinsically meaningful as expressions of virtue. The activity itself becomes the point, not just what it produces. This allows us to find satisfaction in the doing rather than only in the outcome. It means that even if our efforts do not produce the results we hoped for, we have still lived well by engaging virtuously with the task. This process-oriented approach also makes work more enjoyable. When we are focused only on the end result, the process can feel like drudgery, just something to get through to reach the goal. But when we focus on doing the work itself excellently, taking satisfaction in each step well done, the process becomes rewarding. This is what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls flow, the experience of being fully absorbed in an activity for its own sake, losing self-consciousness and sense of time. The Stoics would say that this experience of flow is what happens when we are exercising our rational capacities well, when we are functioning in accordance with our Nature, humans are designed for purposeful activity, for solving problems, for creating and building. When we engage in these activities with full attention and without distraction by ego or anxiety about outcomes, we experience a natural satisfaction. This is part of what the Stoics meant by eudaimonia, the flourishing that comes from exercising our distinctive human capacities. Another aspect of human nature that the Stoics emphasized is our social nature. Humans are not meant to live in isolation. We are communal beings who need others for both practical support and psychological well-being. The Stoics spoke of human society as like a body, with each person being a part that contributes to the whole. Just as it would be absurd for a hand to refuse to help the body because that serves the hand's interests, so it is absurd for us to refuse to help society because that does not serve my interests. This organic view of society suggests that what serves the whole ultimately serves each part. When society functions well, all members benefit. When some members are oppressed or neglected, the whole suffers, even those who seem to be benefiting from the injustice. This is because injustice corrupts those who practice it, damaging their character and their capacity for virtue. A person who exploits others for their own advantage may gain material wealth, but they harm their own soul. The Stoics therefore believe that we have duties to others not merely as a constraint on our self-interest, but as part of our own fulfillment. Helping others, contributing to the common good, treating people justly, these activities are expressions of virtue, and thus part of what it means to live well. When we act selfishly, when we treat others merely as means to our ends, we are failing to live according to our nature as rational and social beings. This perspective has implications for how we think about ethics. Stoic ethics is not primarily about following rules or calculating consequences. It is about developing a character that naturally tends toward right action. A virtuous person does not need to deliberate extensively about whether to help someone in need or whether to keep a promise. These actions flow naturally from their character. They are the expression of who the person is, not something forced by external obligation. This is why the Stoics emphasized education in virtue rather than indoctrination in rules. Rules can be useful as guidelines, especially for those just beginning philosophical practice. But the goal is to internalize the principles so thoroughly that virtuous action becomes second nature. At that point, one does not need to consult rules. One simply sees what the situation requires and does it. This development of moral perception, the ability to see clearly what each situation calls for, is an important aspect of wisdom. It requires both general principles and specific judgment. The principles provide orientation and guidance, but each situation is unique, and applying principles appropriately requires paying attention to the particulars. Wisdom is not mechanical application of rules, but sensitive, intelligent response to the specifics of each case. For example, the principle that we should be honest is clear, but how to apply this in a particular situation might not be. If someone asks you a question, and you know that an honest answer will hurt them, without helping them, what should you do? There is no rule that can cover every such situation. You must use your judgment, considering not only honesty, but also kindness, the person's capacity to handle the truth, whether your silence or evasion will cause more harm than your honesty, and so on. This is why the Stoics emphasize that virtue requires wisdom, that we cannot be good without being intelligent about how to be good. Merely wanting to do right is not enough. We need to understand the situation, anticipate consequences, choose appropriate means. This requires both thought and experience. We learn moral wisdom partly through reflection on principles and partly through observing what works and what does not in actual situations. The Stoics also believe that the virtues are unified, that you cannot really have one without the others. To be truly courageous, you must also be wise, knowing what is worth risking danger for. To be just, you must have the courage to stand up for what is right even when it costs you. To be temperate, you must have the wisdom to distinguish real goods from apparent goods. The virtues support and require each other, forming a unified excellence of character. This unity of virtue has practical significance. It suggests that we cannot pick and choose which virtues to develop, focusing on the ones that come easily to us while neglecting the others. If we want to be truly virtuous, we must work on all aspects of our character. Someone who is kind but not honest, or brave but not just, is not fully virtuous. They have developed some good qualities, but remain incomplete. This also means that character development is a holistic process. Working on one virtue tends to improve the others because they are interconnected. If we develop greater wisdom, this will naturally make us more courageous, more just, and more temperate because we will better understand what these virtues require. If we practice self-control, this will support our wisdom by making us less vulnerable to being swayed by our appetites and emotions. The holistic nature of character development is part of why it takes time. We are not just learning a skill or a piece of information. We are transforming our entire self, reshaping the patterns of thought and reaction that have been developing since childhood. This is deep work that cannot be rushed, but it is also work that gets easier as we progress, because each change reinforces the others, and virtuous action becomes more habitual and natural. Habit, indeed, plays a crucial role in Stoic ethics. Aristotle emphasized that virtue is a matter of habit, and the Stoics agreed with this insight. We become virtuous by practicing virtuous actions until they become our natural response. At first, virtuous action may require conscious effort and may feel forced or unnatural. But over time, as we practice, it becomes easier and more automatic. Eventually, it becomes who we are. This is why daily practice is so important. Each small choice, each moment of applying philosophical principles contributes to shaping our character. Over time, these small choices accumulate into significant transformation. It is like water wearing away stone. Each drop makes an imperceptible difference, but over time the stone is reshaped. Similarly, each moment of choosing wisdom over folly, courage over cowardice, justice over selfishness, temperance over excess, gradually transforms us. This process happens whether we are aware of it or not. We are always forming habits through our repeated actions. The question is whether we are forming good habits or bad ones, whether we are becoming more virtuous or more vicious. If we drift through life without paying attention to this process, we are likely to form whatever habits our circumstances and conditioning push us toward. But if we take responsibility for our character development, we can deliberately cultivate the habits that will serve us well. The Stoics believed that this responsibility, the responsibility for one's own character, is perhaps the most important responsibility we have. We may have many other obligations to family, work, society, but none is more fundamental than the obligation to ourselves to develop our nature, to realize our potential as rational beings, to become wise and virtuous. This is not selfish, because a virtuous person naturally acts for the good of others. When we perfect our own character, we become better able to contribute to the world. This brings us to the question of the ultimate aim of Stoic philosophy. What is the point of all this self-cultivation, all this attention to virtue and wisdom? The Stoics answered, eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness, but might better be rendered as flourishing or living well. Eudaimonia is not a feeling or a state that comes and goes. It is the quality of a life lived in accordance with virtue, a life that fulfills our nature as rational and social beings. A person who has achieved eudaimonia might not feel constantly pleased or excited. They might face difficulties and disappointments like anyone else, but there is a deep satisfaction in their life, a sense that they are living as they should, that their life has meaning and dignity regardless of external circumstances. They do not depend on fortune for their well-being, because they have placed their well-being in something fortune cannot touch: their own virtue. This conception of happiness differs markedly from what many people today understand understand by happiness. We often think of happiness as pleasure, as feeling good, as having things go our way. The Stoics would say this is not true happiness, but merely pleasure or satisfaction, which is fleeting and dependent on circumstances. True happiness eudaimonia is deeper and more stable. It is compatible with difficulty and discomfort because it does not depend on things going well externally. It depends only on living virtuously. This is a challenging conception for many people. We are conditioned to seek pleasure and avoid pain, to measure our well-being by how we feel and how things are going. The Stoic inversion of these priorities, putting virtue above pleasure, character above circumstances, requires a significant shift in perspective. But those who make this shift often report that it is profoundly liberating. When you no longer need everything to go well to be okay, you are free from constant anxiety. When you find satisfaction in living virtuously regardless of outcomes, you have a stable source of well-being that circumstances cannot take away. This is not to say that Stoics do not care about outcomes, or that they do not work to make things better. They do care and they do work, but they hold outcomes lightly, not letting their peace depend on achieving them. They do their best and accept whatever results. This attitude allows them to engage fully with life without being attached to specific outcomes, to care without being anxious, to work hard without being stressed. This balanced engagement is perhaps the most practical benefit of Stoic philosophy. It allows us to live fully and actively in the world without being controlled by the world. We can have relationships without being dependent on others for our well-being. We can pursue meaningful work without being devastated by failure. We can enjoy pleasures without becoming addicted to them. We can face difficulties without being crushed by them. This emotional freedom is what the Stoics saw as the true prize of philosophy. Achieving this freedom requires consistent practice over time. It requires examining our beliefs and judgments, testing them against reality, correcting those that lead to disturbance. It requires training our attention to focus on what is within our control rather than being distracted by what is not. It requires cultivating the virtues through repeated practice until they become habitual. It requires studying wisdom, both in texts and in life, learning from both success and failure. This is the work of philosophy, as the Stoics understood it. It is not easy work, and it is never complete. We can always go deeper, understand more clearly, respond more virtuously. There is always more to learn, always room for improvement. But this is not discouraging. It means that the philosophical life is an ongoing adventure, a continuous process of growth and discovery. As long as we are alive, we have the opportunity to become wiser and better. The Stoics approach this work with a certain lightness of spirit. Yes, it is serious work. Our character and our well-being depend on it. But it is also a natural human activity, the fulfillment of our nature. It should be undertaken with dedication, but not with grim determination. There's joy in practicing virtue, satisfaction in thinking clearly, pleasure in living according to nature. The philosophical life, though it requires discipline, is not joyless. Indeed, the Stoics believed it is the most joyful life possible because it is the life of freedom. This joy comes partly from the relief of putting down the heavy burden of needing everything to be different than it is. When we accept reality as it is, when we stop struggling against what we cannot change, we experience a lightness, a sense of ease. We are no longer at war with the world, no longer exhausted from trying to control the uncontrollable. We can relax into life, responding to what comes with flexibility and grace rather than rigid resistance. This acceptance does not mean we become passive or indifferent. We still prefer some outcomes to others, still work toward what seems good, but we do so without desperation, without the anxiety that comes from thinking we must have things go a certain way. We understand that we will be okay regardless of how things turn out, because our well-being depends on our virtue, not on circumstances. This understanding allows us to engage with life more fully because we are not holding back out of fear. Fear, in fact, is one of the main obstacles to living well that the Stoics addressed. Most people are motivated largely by fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of death, fear of humiliation. These fears drive us to protective behaviors, to trying to control everything, to avoiding risk and challenge. But in protecting ourselves from what we fear, we often cut ourselves off from what makes life worth living. We play it safe and end up with a narrow, constricted life. The Stoic response to fear is not to eliminate it. Some degree of fear is natural and even useful as a signal of danger, but we should not be controlled by fear. We should be able to feel fear and still act according to reason and virtue. This is courage, not the absence of fear, but the ability to act rightly despite fear. When we understand that the things we fear, loss, pain, even death, cannot actually harm what is most important in us, fear loses much of its power. Death, in particular, was a frequent subject of Stoic reflection. The Stoics did not see death as an evil. It is simply a natural process, the end of the cycle of birth and growth. Every living thing dies. This is part of nature, not a violation of it. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself of this, contemplating the deaths of great emperors and philosophers of the past, reflecting that all of them are now dust, that all will be forgotten eventually. This contemplation was not morbid but liberating. If death is natural and inevitable, there is no point in fearing it or denying it. Better to accept it and focus on living well while we can. The Stoics also pointed out that we have already experienced something like death the time before we were born. We were not troubled by our non-existence then. Why should we be troubled by returning to that state? Death is simply the end of our particular existence, the dissolution of the temporary combination of elements that made up our body and mind. The universe continues, the cycle of nature goes on. We will rejoin the whole from which we came. This naturalistic view of death, which sees it as part of the cosmic cycle rather than as a tragedy or punishment, can reduce much of the anxiety surrounding death. Of course, most people still prefer to live rather than die, and the Stoics acknowledged this natural preference, but they insisted that death should not be feared or treated as the worst thing that can happen. In fact, the worst thing that can happen is to live badly, to fail to develop one's character, to waste one's rational capacities on trivial pursuits or corrupt actions. This ranking of evils, that vice is worse than death, allowed the Stoics to maintain their integrity even under threat. Socrates, who inspired much of Stoic philosophy, chose to accept execution rather than compromise his principles. He said it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it, better to die than to live with a corrupted soul. The Stoics inherited this attitude. They believed that death can come only once, but dishonor in avoiding it lasts as long as we live. This does not mean the Stoics courted death or thought life was not worth living. They valued life and believed we should preserve it reasonably, but they understood life's value correctly. It is valuable as an opportunity to exercise virtue and reason, not as an end in itself. When life no longer offers this opportunity, or when preserving life would require acting viciously, death becomes preferable. But for most people in most circumstances, life offers ample opportunity for virtue, and so we should embrace life and make the most of it. Making the most of life, from a Stoic perspective, means living each day fully and virtuously, not postponing living until some future date when conditions are better. We have only now, this present moment. We do not know how much time we have. Therefore, we should not waste the time we have on things that do not matter. Seneca wrote extensively about how most people squander their lives, treating time as if it were unlimited, only to find themselves at the end wondering where it went. The Stoics encouraged us to be mindful of time's passage, to remember that each day might be our last, to treat each moment as precious. This awareness can transform how we live. When we remember that time is limited, we are less likely to waste it on trivial grievances or meaningless pursuits. We are more likely to focus on what really matters, developing our character, contributing to others, appreciating what we have. This brings us back to where we began, the importance of understanding what is within our control and what is not, and of focusing our energy on what we can actually influence. Our time, our attention, our thoughts, our response is these are ours. We should use them wisely. Everything else is borrowed, temporary, subject to change. We can enjoy these external goods when we have them, but we should not mistake them for what is truly ours or truly important. The Stoic view of life, then, is one of engaged acceptance. We accept reality as it is, including its impermanence and its mixture of pleasure and pain, but we do not passively resign ourselves to whatever happens. We actively engage with life, working to improve circumstances where we can, contributing to the common good, cultivating our own character. We do all this with the understanding that outcomes are not entirely in our control, and that our well-being does not depend on achieving particular results. This combination of acceptance and engagement, of caring deeply while holding lightly, of full commitment alongside detachment from outcomes, this is the Stoic art of living. It requires practice to balance these seeming opposites, but they are not actually contradictory. They are complementary aspects of a mature engagement with life. When we master this balance, we find that we can live fully without being anxious, care deeply without being destroyed by loss, work hard without being attached to success. The Stoic path is not for everyone. Some people are content with a life guided by pleasure and pain, success and failure, hope and fear. They may not feel the need for philosophy or see the value in examining their beliefs and cultivating virtue. The Stoics would say these people are missing out on the deepest satisfactions life offers, but they cannot be forced to philosophize. Each person must choose their own path. For those who are drawn to philosophy, who sense that there is something more to life than the pursuit of external goods, who want to understand themselves and reality more deeply, the Stoic tradition offers a rich and tested path. It has sustained people through every kind of circumstance: slavery and empire, war and peace, prosperity and poverty. Its principles have helped countless individuals find meaning and maintain dignity regardless of their situations. The beauty of Stoic philosophy is that it does not require special circumstances or resources to practice. You do not need wealth, power, perfect health, or ideal conditions. You need only your own mind and the willingness to examine your thoughts and work on your character. This can be done anywhere, at any time, in any situation. The essentials of philosophy are always available to you because they are internal. This accessibility is part of why Stoicism has endured for over 2 millennia and why it remains relevant today. The specific circumstances of life change. We live in very different world than ancient Rome, but the fundamental challenges of human existence remain the same. We still must deal with loss, face difficulties, navigate relationships, make choices about how to live. We still must confront our mortality and figure out what gives life meaning. The Stoic insights into these perennial challenges are as useful now as they were 2,000 years ago. In fact, in some ways, Stoicism may be even more relevant today than in the ancient world. Modern life, with its constant stimulation, its emphasis on individual gratification, its erosion of traditional sources of meaning, creates particular challenges that Stoic philosophy is well equipped to address. The Stoic emphasis on internal goods over external ones, on virtue over pleasure, on rational self-control over emotional reactivity. These perspectives offer a needed counterbalance to many contemporary trends. At the same time, we must be careful not to apply Stoic principles rigidly or to use them as an excuse for indifference to injustice or suffering. The Stoics themselves were often actively engaged in trying to improve their societies. Marcus Aurelius worked to govern justly and to protect his people. Seneca was involved in politics and tried, though not always successfully, to influence Nero toward better rule. Epictetus taught students and tried to spread philosophical understanding. The Stoic acceptance of fate does not mean acceptance of injustice or refusal to work for change. It means accepting what has already happened and what we cannot change, while working diligently on what we can influence. If we see injustice, we should oppose it. If we see suffering we can alleviate, we should help. But we should do these things calmly and rationally, without the added disturbance of outrage or despair, and without depending on our efforts succeeding for our own peace of mind. This distinction is subtle but important. We can care about justice and work for it vigorously without making our happiness depend on achieving it. We can be deeply compassionate toward those who suffer without taking on their suffering as our own. We can engage fully with the world's problems while maintaining our inner stability. This balanced engagement allows us to be more effective because we are not drained by anxiety or paralyzed by hopelessness. As we near the end of this exploration of Stoic philosophy, let us return once more to its core insights. Life is a mixture of things we can control and things we cannot. Wisdom lies in distinguishing between them and focusing on what is truly ours: our thoughts, judgments, and responses. External goods, health, wealth, reputation have practical value, but are not essential for living well. What is essential is virtue, excellence of character expressed through wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Virtue is developed through practice, through repeatedly choosing to act according to reason rather than impulse, according to principle rather than passion. This practice requires self-awareness, honest self-examination, and willingness to correct our mistakes. It is supported by daily philosophical exercises: morning meditation, evening review, contemplation of impermanence, study of wisdom, imitation of exemplary people. The goal of this practice is eudaimonial, life well lived, a flourishing that comes from fulfilling our nature as rational and social beings. This flourishing does not depend on external circumstances but on the quality of our character and the soundness of our judgments. It is stable, deep, and reliable in a way that pleasure-based happiness can never be. Living according to these principles provides freedom, not the freedom to do whatever we want, but the freedom from being controlled by external circumstances or internal passions. It provides resilience, the ability to face difficulty without being broken. It provides meaning, the satisfaction of living virtuously and contributing to the common good. It provides peace, the calm that comes from accepting reality as it is and responding to it wisely. These benefits are not automatic. They come through consistent practice over time. There will be setbacks and struggles. Old patterns do not disappear overnight, but with patience and persistence, transformation is possible. We can become wiser, more virtuous, more free. We can develop a character that remains stable through life's changes, that finds satisfaction in the practice of virtue itself. This is the promise and the challenge of Stoic philosophy. It offers not easy answers or quick fixes, but a demanding path that leads to genuine transformation. It asks us to examine our deepest beliefs, to question what we have always assumed, to take responsibility for our own inner life. It asks us to commit to daily practice, to keep working on ourselves even when we do not see immediate results, to trust that over time, the practice will bear fruit. For those willing to undertake this work, the Stoic tradition provides not only philosophical principles, but a community extending across centuries. When we read Marcus Aurelius or Seneca or Epictetus, we are joining a conversation that has been going on for over 2,000 years. We are connecting with people who face the same essential challenges we face, and who found in philosophy a way to live well despite those challenges. This connection can be a source of strength and encouragement. We are not alone in our struggles. The difficulties we face are not unique or unprecedented. Others have walked this path before us, and their wisdom is available to guide us. We can learn from their insights, be inspired by their example, and take comfort in knowing that the philosophical life is possible because others have lived it. At the same time, each person must make the path their own. We cannot simply follow ancient prescriptions mechanically. We must understand the principles deeply enough to apply them intelligently to our own circumstances. We must test them against our own experience and make them our own through practice. Philosophy is not about memorizing doctrines, but about transforming how we live. This transformation happens gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. We might not notice that we are becoming calmer, more patient, more thoughtful, but others may notice. And over time, we will look back and realize how much we have changed, how differently we respond to situations that once would have disturbed us greatly. This is the fruit of philosophical practice, not dramatic sudden enlightenment, but steady, cumulative growth toward wisdom and virtue. The journey has no final destination, because there is always room for improvement, always more to learn, always deeper understanding to achieve. Even the wisest person can become wiser. This means the philosophical life is never boring or complete. There's always something to work on, always new challenges that test and develop our character. This ongoing process of growth and learning is itself part of what makes life meaningful. In closing, let us remember that Stoic philosophy is not about withdrawing from life, but about engaging with it more fully and effectively. It is not about becoming emotionless, but about having appropriate emotions that serve rather than control us. It is not about denying that bad things happen, but about recognizing that we can respond to them virtuously. It is not about fatalistic resignation, but about active acceptance combined with wise action. The Stoic view of life sees reality clearly, accepts it honestly, and responds to it virtuously. It finds freedom in accepting what we cannot change and working skillfully with what we can. It locates happiness in virtue rather than in external circumstances. It offers a path to lasting peace and genuine fulfillment. This path is open to anyone willing to walk it, requiring only attention, practice, and persistence. May these reflections on Stoic philosophy serve as a beginning for your own exploration and practice. May they inspire you to examine your own beliefs and patterns, to work on developing your character, to live more thoughtfully and deliberately. The wisdom of the Stoics is not merely ancient history, but living guidance that can transform how you experience life. The only question is whether you will take up the practice, whether you will commit to the philosophical life. The choice, as always, is yours. And that choice, like all our choices, is one of the few things truly within our power. Choose wisely.